The South African economy has fallen into its first recession in nearly a decade. The latest GDP figures show domestic output declined by 0.7% in the second quarter, and that follows a bigger decline in January to March. The results underscore challenges for President Cyril Ramaphosa, who's now tasked with reviving an economy that's been stagnant since 2013. Now, agricultural output dropped nearly 30% compared to last year. Transport, communications and storage industries also saw their sales drop over the same period. Meanwhile, inflation hit a 10-month high of 5.1% in July. But with the slowdown in growth, the central bank will find it hard to raise interest rates to bring prices under control. Now, one of Ramaphosa's proposed economic remedies has been to tackle deep inequality. Last month, he announced plans to redistribute land from white farmers back to the black majority without compensation. This week, Parliament is reviewing the proposed changes to the Constitution. But as Laila Humairah reports, it's a controversial and potentially risky move.
Before 2013, Errol April knew nothing about growing apples. Now, he's the face of a success story for black farmers in South Africa. He's one of a few black South Africans to receive land formerly owned by a white farmer. And Errol has turned it into a sustainable business.
I'm fortunate that I've been given this opportunity at such an early stage in the history of the country, where land is not only a contentious issue, but also it becomes a must that it must be returned to the people.
Under apartheid rule, black South Africans were stripped of their land and banned from owning property. The laws confined the majority of the population to 10% of the land. Years after the end of white rule, they're still struggling to recover their assets. Today, white South Africans make up about 8% of the population, but own more than 70% of farmland. In 1995, the first democratically elected president, Nelson Mandela, took power. He promised to return the land to the black majority. More than 2 decades later, Cyril Ramaphosa is looking to fulfill that promise.
The intention of this proposed amendment is to promote redress, advance economic development, increase agricultural production and food security. It will also transform the unjust spatial realities in urban areas.
The controversial reform would allow the government to seize land from white farmers without paying for it. But investors are worried about how it could impact wider property rights. Analysts from the Bank of America Merrill Lynch say outright land grabs are unlikely, but ongoing uncertainty might hinder investments. Others say the government should be focusing on improving conditions for the millions living in cities.
So the challenge for the South African government, shall we say 24 years into post-apartheid South Africa, is to make sure that they manage the urbanizing process that was interrupted by apartheid, and that means investing in access to land for the majority of South Africans.
As South Africa debates Ramaphosa's land reform, he'll hope for an outcome that won't upset the apple cart. Laila Humairah, TRT World.
For more on South Africa's troubles, let's bring in independent economist Thabi Leoka, who joins us from Johannesburg. Thabi, great to have you on the show. Let's start with the latest GDP numbers. Technically now, South Africa is in a recession. Were you surprised by the latest figures?
Yes, definitely. So I've expected a slight improvement in GDP numbers, but only slight, about a 0.3% increase. But I didn't expect the 0.7% contraction. I also didn't expect the revision of the first quarter from 2.2% to 2.6% contraction. And that's why we have this technical recession of the first quarter and the second quarter posting negative growth.
Thabi, the rand has weakened by around 30% since March. Give us an idea of how that has affected ordinary people on the ground in South Africa.
Yeah, so the agricultural sector, for instance, the reason why it has done so badly is because of the droughts that have been that we've seen in the Western Cape. We've also seen in one of our provinces called Mpumalanga, there was a severe rainfall, and that rainfall that came with it actually basically impacted on the crops there, and so farmers were then held back in terms of production. We also saw lower production in horticulture. So that's basically from the agricultural side. We also saw a decline in the manufacturing sector, which has been performing very badly, even when compared to, if you look at the PMIs, compared to other emerging markets. The South African PMI, the latest ones, was substantially weaker. Also, it's a sign that the manufacturing sector is underperforming. Trade was also weak, which also speaks to the lower demand and activity in retail sales. If you look, for instance, at the expenditure side of GDP, household consumption expenditure contracted, investment contracted, and imports contracted. All three are related because demand is slower, investment is slower, and household consumption.
Thabi, you're painting a pretty bleak picture of the South African economy here. Do you think that this is the right time to be launching into this process to redistribute land, which could be potentially a very dangerous move if it goes wrong?
So I don't think it's a bad policy at all. Remember that it is within our constitution to expropriate land without compensation. Also, another thing is that the GDP growth has been underperforming for many years. And I don't think that land reform will actually slow down GDP growth. I think in the long run, it would actually be a positive when land is equally distributed. And also there's some land that is fallow. And if you then put those who want to have agricultural activity and start producing in that land, I think that will contribute towards GDP as well. More significantly, we need also land for surety. Right? So if you have title deeds, you can use those title deeds in order for you to borrow against your property, start a business. So land, actually, if you look at like what Hernando de Soto, the famous Peruvian economist, talks about, land is a stimulus for growth.
Now, next door to South Africa, Zimbabwe, they redistributed land under Robert Mugabe. That was disastrous. That ruined their economy. Are you confident that the policy mix surrounding this issue in South Africa is going to avoid that same fate?
We're not going to see land grabs. As I said, expropriation without compensation has been a policy within our constitution since 1994. And so we haven't seen land grabs then, even though it is within our constitution. So I don't expect to see land grabs going forward. It will be orderly. It is a process that has to be done as part of our structural reforms.
Economist Thabi Leoka in Johannesburg, thank you very much indeed.